Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Don't Risk It podcast presented by VFIS Client Risk Solutions. This program focuses on the exposures our clients frequently encounter and discusses some potential solutions to help reduce these exposures. I'm your host, Chris Rogers with VFIS Client Risk Solutions, and today we're discussing modified response and the use of lights and sirens in your organization. I want to welcome Mike Baker, Dave Bradley, Brian DeQuinn, and Blair Tyndall back to the program. They're all members of the VFIS Client Risk Solutions team, and they're here to offer some suggestions if your organization is considering modified response. Gentlemen, thank you for joining me today. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Chris.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Chris.
So let's start this discussion by visiting the age-old question we hear quite often at VFIS. What is the difference in response times by utilizing lights and sirens? While you might not be able to answer that question directly, can you offer me some general thoughts?
Chris, I'll start this off. It's not necessarily my thought, but I read in a publication by the National Association of EMS Physicians. It was recently conducted, actually, even in 2022 here. It indicates the average time saved by lights and siren response or transport ranges from anywhere from 42 seconds to maybe 3.8 minutes. But alternatively, lights and sirens response, that same thing, increases the chance of an EMS vehicle crash by 50%. And almost triples the chance of a crash during a patient transport. That in my mind, is a telling fact.
So we've titled the episode, modified response. So can you give the listeners an overview or description of what modified response means?
Sure, Chris, I can take that one. There's some standards out in the industry that have been there for years. Emergency medical dispatch, priority fire dispatch, that by questioning the caller, the dispatcher is able to identify what is a potentially life-threatening emergency, whether it be a fire with entrapment or a cardiac event, and what of those events that may not need that urgent or emergent response. And, when we talk about modified response, we may not be talking about the number of vehicles that are going to a set event, but how they're going to that set event. For instance, and we're going to talk, I'm sure, later about some of those instances, but if you think about an automatic fire alarm where a typical fire department says for easy math, 5 vehicles to that scene, lights and sirens, if we reduce that by 1 vehicle hot and the other's normal flow of traffic, we've reduced that risk by 80%. So modified response is really thinking about how you're responding to the event that you're dispatched for.
So before we go into some of the nuances of exposures and controls and whatnot with modified response, is that a formal policy that should be written into our response guidelines, or is this just kind of an idea that our organization? How do we put that into effect?
Chris, I'll take that. So absolutely, it's something that your organization really needs to think about and consider and turn that into a guideline. At the end of the day, that guideline is going to provide you some flexibility based on the additional information that you receive, but it's not really something to consider. It's really something you need to implement within the organization. At the end of the day, our goal is to reduce risk as much as possible. And, like Dave said, do we really need all 5 of those units responding to an automatic fire alarm that we've been to 6 times in the last 2 weeks? That guideline, based on what that additional information, maybe today we do need to have all 5 of those units going in emergency mode or hot, however you refer to it. Just something to really start focusing in on.
And just to follow up on that, Brian's exactly right by having the policies and procedures in place, but moreover what we call guidelines, so you can deviate from those guidelines. And I think it's important that everybody understand why we have a set guideline, that a chief officer or maybe another officer that's already on the scene or has different information can change the response as well, the response level as well, even after communications has sent that initial dispatch out.
Is this process something that we need to train on or practice, or do we just integrate it into how we send our units out?
So I think it's something that we need to discuss. I think at the end of the day, all of the members of the organization need to be aware of what that guideline is. I think all of the drivers, all of the officers, or your senior people that may be officers need to be aware of. It's not necessarily something you're going to train on, but it's certainly something that dialogue needs to happen, and it needs to happen frequently as we implement this guideline.
I think the other side, too, is the guideline is the expectation. So the expectation of leadership is that you follow the guideline And with that additional dispatch information and so forth, if you deviate from that guideline, then there should be a reasonable expectation that you can, convey the actual reasons why you deviated from that guideline.
Just to add a little bit to this, I work with several EMS agencies that have a lights and sirens policy that almost treat it as a protocol that says the use of lights and sirens needs to have a positive impact on the outcome of that patient. And on the backside of that, they QA 100% of the lights and sirens uses for transport. Obviously, if you're an EMD organization, the dispatch center is identifying your response mode. But if they're transporting a patient, lights and sirens, 100% audit to look at what was the value to the patient. Was it a clinically indicated to treat that patient with lights and sirens?
And sometimes the decision to modify your response could be community-based, because I have an account in Louisiana that their roads basically run along a bayou, and they had a large number of citizens who were trying to do the right thing, get out of the way of the fire truck. Well, they were driving basically into the bayou, and so they were creating more hazards by trying to get out of the way and do the right thing for the fire trucks. So they realized that it's better for us to run without lights and sirens, so we don't alert or scare the people in front of us, and then generate more scenes. So there's a lot of reasons to look into modified response. So let's talk about some of the exposures. What are some of the exposures that we can limit as a result of modified response guidelines?
There's three things we really want to factor in here. First off is you and your crew. So that's the primary exposure that we're looking to limit here. The second is the exposure to other people in the community. And when I say that, by doing an emergency response, again, I'm a stat guy. The wake effect collisions, those that happen after you've gone through an emergency situation with emergency response, are 4 times more common than crashes involving the emergency vehicle itself. So, we don't have all those crashes that we have here at VFIS involving you as the emergency vehicle. There's 4 times more of them out in the community that don't even involve us, that we probably don't even hear about, because they're in the wake of our emergency response. And of course, the third thing that we look at from an exposure standpoint is going to be your vehicle. And boy, what a crazy year 2022 has been with the replacement of vehicles or repair of vehicles out there. I think we can all understand with the supply chain disruptions and so forth. We've all heard from our vehicle manufacturers the increased length of time it takes to either repair or replace your emergency vehicle. So 3 great things to consider is your crew, yourself, the general public, and then your vehicle and your property as well.
So what types of alarms should be considered for modified response? Can you give us some examples of such?
Yes, Chris, I'll give a few examples. Water shuttle for our departments that have tankers or tenders that are providing water supply. Those can be considered to be non-emergency or modified response. Automatic fire alarms that have reoccurred over time. Automatic fire alarms in a building that we know is occupied. So we're going to have good information coming back from the scene there. So those kinds of things to consider. Outdoor fires with no vehicle exposures or no structural exposures. Trees and wires down. CO alarms with no reported illness or injuries. Vehicle accidents with no injuries, or vehicle accident with property damage only. Those are just a few of the ones that we can take into account, and it's all going to be jurisdictionally based.
I think it's important that as organizations you have that discussion though on what some of the nature codes that your organization runs. So maybe an outside investigation or just a smells call that there's no known source. That's another example. So I think if you think about the call volumes that you see as an organization and the call type specifically, you really should take the time to narrate that down to figure out where do we need to risk higher to achieve, rapid response, or, so we think, as we indicated earlier, that 42 seconds to 3.8 minutes, depending on where you're at, you're not gaining a whole lot of time out of this.
So we're a national company. We obviously like to develop resources for our clients, but this is almost seems like it's a regional or jurisdictional thing to develop. Are there any resources out there or any sites, studies that you all would recommend that might help listeners out?
Certainly, going back to my comment earlier, looking at priority fire dispatch, emergency medical dispatch, working with your dispatch center to see what they may be able to identify as one of those areas that could be modified response. But clearly looking at the national standards that kind of dictate these kind of responses.
Chris, I think it's also important that we have these conversations with our mutual aid organizations as well. Our policy might be that we do the modified response, but our mutual aid may not follow that same concept. So whatever that guideline is, I think that guideline needs to be shared across the board. And maybe that's a county-wide system or a county-wide approach or, municipality-driven. Again, looking at where you're at, it's important that you get all the key players involved together.
And I'll end it by saying that this is a culture shift. The fire service over time and the EMS service. EMS, I think, is advanced a little bit further into this topic than fireside has. But really, it's a culture shift in the mentality of we got to get there right away. The truth be, and we say it in our driver training programs, if you don't get there, then your next dude's going to get there and you're already at a delayed response. So we'd rather that not happen either. So make sure that you take the time as your organization to take a heartfelt evaluation of the way you're doing your job and consider a delayed response or a diminished response or modified response, whatever you want to call it, in your organization. I think you'll be glad you did.
Absolutely. There's a lot of moving parts to it, and you have all highlighted that it's kind of each organization needs to figure out what works best for them versus a one-size-fits-all model. Gentlemen, I really appreciate your time. Thank you for being here. It's always a pleasure to talk with you all.
Thanks for having us again, Chris.
Thank you, Chris.
Always good to be here, Chris.
Thanks, Chris. Appreciate it.
And I want to thank you for listening to the program today and for your interest in VFIS safety resources. I want to thank our guests once again, Mike Baker, Blair Tyndall, Dave Bradley, and Brian DeQuinn for their time and information. Please consider subscribing to our program to stay up to date on new content releases. Also, if you like what you've heard, please consider leaving a review below. For more information about the many resources available from VFIS, please visit VFIS.com. And to submit ideas for future discussions, please reach out by email at VFISriskcontrol@VFIS.com. Thanks, everyone, and have a great day. The views, information, or opinions expressed during this program are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of Gladfelter Insurance Group, VFIS, and its employees. Additionally, all views, information, or opinions expressed are provided for informational purposes only and should not be construed as legal, medical, or other professional advice on any subject matter.